Everyone laughed when the broke cowboy walked away from the poker table with 8 old donkeys instead of cash. They thought he was a fool. But they didn't know the secret he was hiding, and what he did with those animals just days later left the entire town in total silence. The air inside the Dusty Boot Saloon was thick with the smell of old tobacco and spilled whiskey. A single lantern hung from the ceiling and cast long shadows across the faces of the men at the table. Elias sat in a corner chair with his hat pulled low. He was a man who had seen better days. His coat was thin and his hands were stained with the red dirt of the plains. He looked at the small pile of coins in front of him. It was all he had left in the world. Across from him sat Miller. Miller was a man who owned half the cattle in the valley and acted like he owned the people too. He wore a gold watch and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He had been winning all night. He liked to watch men break. He liked to see them lose their pride along with their money. Miller looked at Elias and let out a short laugh. He told Elias that he should go home before he lost his boots. The game was reaching its end. The pot in the middle of the table was the largest of the night. Elias felt the weight of the silence in the room. Every eye was on him. He knew he had a strong hand, but he did not have enough cash to match Miller's last bet. Miller knew it too. He leaned back and reached into his vest pocket. He did not pull out money. Instead, he tossed a crumpled stack of yellow papers onto the table. Miller explained that those were the deeds to 8 donkeys he kept at the north end of his ranch. He called them a pack of useless bones. He said they were too old to work and too stubborn to die. He told the room that he was tired of feeding them. He offered the donkeys as a way to stay in the game. The men at the bar started to chuckle. A cowboy winning a herd of broken donkeys was the best joke they had heard in years. Elias did not laugh. He looked at the papers and then he looked at his cards. He saw the way Miller's fingers flicked against the wood of the table. It was a nervous habit Miller only had when he was bluffing. Elias felt a strange spark of hope. He did not care about the money anymore. He thought about those animals and the way Miller treated everything he owned. Elias pushed his last coins into the center. He called the bet. The room went dead silent as Miller turned over his cards. He had a pair of kings. He reached for the pot with a grin. But Elias stopped him. He laid his cards down one by one. He had a straight. The grin slid off Miller's face like melting wax. The laughter in the saloon stopped instantly. Elias did not celebrate. He reached out and gathered the coins and the yellow papers. He had won a prize that everyone else thought was a curse. He stood up and walked toward the door. He had 8 lives to claim and a plan that was already forming in his mind. The next morning was cold and gray. Elias walked to the edge of the Miller ranch where the dirt was hard and nothing grew. He found a small pen made of broken wire and rotting wood. There stood the 8 donkeys. They were huddling together to stay warm against the biting wind. When Elias approached the fence, none of them moved. They did not even lift their heads. They looked like statues made of dust and sorrow. Elias climbed over the wire and stepped into the pen. The ground was dry and there was no sign of fresh water or hay. He walked up to the smallest donkey and reached out his hand. The animal flinched and pulled back as if it expected a blow. Its coat was matted with burrs and its ribs were sharp under the skin. All 8 of them were in the same condition. Their hooves were overgrown and cracked. Their eyes were cloudy and lacked the spark of life. Elias felt a surge of quiet anger in his chest. He knew Miller was a rich man, but he had let these creatures rot simply because they were no longer useful to him. He began to talk to them in a soft and steady voice. He told them that the days of hunger were over. He told them that they were leaving the Miller ranch forever. He took a rope from his belt and began to lead them out of the pen one by one. The walk through the center of town was not easy. Elias moved slowly because the donkeys were weak. The people of the town came out of their shops to watch the parade. A group of men standing outside the general store began to point and hoot. They called Elias the King of Rags. They asked him if he was planning to start a museum for old bones. One man threw a piece of dry bread at the feet of the lead donkey and laughed when the animal was too tired to even look at it. Elias kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He did not look at the people, and he did not answer their insults. He held the lead rope firmly and kept a steady pace. He could feel the weight of their judgment. In a town where horses were symbols of power and speed, these donkeys were seen as a joke. To the people, they were just a burden that would soon die. They thought Elias was a fool who had wasted his winning hand on trash. But Elias saw things differently. He noticed the way the lead donkey kept its footing on the loose gravel despite its weakness. He saw the strength in their thick necks and the intelligence in their long ears. These were not useless animals. They were survivors. They had lived through Miller's cruelty, and they were still standing. As they reached the edge of town, the mockery faded behind them. The silence of the open trail took over. Elias looked back at the 8 tired animals following him into the dust. He knew the town would have a very different opinion of them soon. For now he just needed to get them to the mountains before the sun went down. The trail into the mountains was steep and narrow. The air grew thinner and colder as Elias led his 8 companions higher into the rocks. The town was now just a small cluster of dots in the distance. Here, the ground was made of jagged stone and loose shale. It was a place where a heavy horse would struggle to find its footing, but the donkeys moved with a natural grace. Even in their weakened state, they knew how to place their small hooves with care. By noon, the smallest donkey stopped. Her legs began to shake and she let out a low, pained sound. She could go no further. Elias did not use a whip or a loud voice to make her move. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes and knew her heart was willing but her body was broken. He took off his heavy coat and laid it on the ground. Then, he did something that would have made the townspeople gasp in shock. He knelt down, wrapped his strong arms around the animal, and lifted her. Elias was not a giant man, but his life of hard labor had made his muscles like iron. He carried the donkey across his shoulders. He felt her warmth and the steady beat of her heart against his neck. The other 7 donkeys followed close behind. They seemed to understand that this man was different from the others. He was not a master to be feared, but a leader to be trusted. Elias stepped carefully over the rocks, his breath coming in short bursts, but he did not stop. Finally, the narrow path opened up into a hidden basin. It was a secret world tucked away between 3 high peaks. Below them lay a lush valley filled with tall, green grass that had never been touched by a plow. A cold spring bubbled out from the base of a cliff and gathered into a crystal-clear pool. The air was sweet with the smell of pine and wild clover. It was a paradise that the greedy ranchers like Miller had never found. Elias set the small donkey down on the soft grass. She immediately began to graze, her tail flicking with a new energy. The others rushed toward the water and drank deeply. Elias sat on a large rock and watched them. He was exhausted and his muscles burned from the climb, but he felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. He knew the town thought he was a fool for winning these 8 animals, but looking at them now, he knew he was the luckiest man in the world. He had found a place where they could all heal together. The days in the hidden valley turned into weeks. The sharp mountain air and the sweet grass worked a miracle on the 8 donkeys. Their ribs disappeared under layers of healthy muscle. Their coats grew thick and soft, turning shades of deep chocolate and dusty silver. Elias spent every waking hour with them. He did not just feed them, he studied them. He learned which ones were the bravest and which ones were the most patient. He treated their cracked hooves and brushed the burrs from their manes until they shone in the morning sun. But Elias was not just resting. He began a strange and difficult routine that would have confused anyone watching from afar. He started by building a heavy wooden sled. Every morning, he would harness 2 donkeys to the sled and pile it high with heavy river stones. He did not ask them to run. He asked them to pull slowly and steadily up the steepest slopes of the valley. He led them through narrow gaps between boulders where there was barely enough room to breathe. He walked them through thick, sucking mud near the spring and over slippery, wet river rocks. The townspeople began to notice that Elias was missing. Rumors started to fly. Some said he had died in a mountain storm. Others said he had gone crazy and was living like a wild animal with his worthless prizes. Occasionally, a hunter would spot Elias far up on the ridges. They told stories in the saloon about a man who was training donkeys to carry massive loads over ground that no horse could ever cross. They laughed and called it a circus for fools. Miller was the loudest of them all, mocking the cowboy for wasting his life on animals meant for the scrap heap. Elias ignored the world below. He was focused on a specific mystery. He was teaching the donkeys to stay calm in the face of chaos. He would drop heavy logs near them to simulate the sound of thunder. He would lead them through rushing water until they no longer feared the pull of the current. He was not training them to be farm animals. He was training them to be an elite team. He spoke to them in a low code of whistles and clicks. They began to move as one unit, responding to his slightest movement without a second of hesitation. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, Elias sat by his small fire. The donkeys stood around him in a circle, their long ears twitching at the sounds of the night. They were no longer the broken creatures from the Miller Ranch. They were powerful, sure-footed, and completely fearless. Elias looked at the lead donkey, the one he had carried on his back, and saw a sharp intelligence in her eyes. He knew a storm was coming to the valley soon. He could feel it in his bones. He didn't know when or how, but he knew that his secret work in this hidden valley was about to be put to the ultimate test. The town would soon realize that he hadn't won a joke at that poker table. He had won an army of heroes. The sky turned a bruised shade of purple, and the air became deathly still. Then, the clouds broke. It was not a normal rain. It was a wall of water that fell for 3 days without stopping. From his hidden valley, Elias watched the mountain streams turn into roaring brown rivers. He knew what was happening below. The small town sat in a basin where 3 canyons met. All that water had only one place to go. By the 4th morning, the sound of the rain was replaced by a terrifying roar. A massive flash flood had ripped through the center of the town. Elias rushed down the mountain trails, his 8 donkeys following him in a perfect line. When he reached the edge of the valley, the scene was a nightmare. The main bridge had been snapped like a dry twig. On the far side of a deep, muddy ravine, a group of children and their teacher were trapped on a crumbling ledge. Behind them was a sheer cliff, and below them was a churning sea of mud and debris. The townspeople were gathered at the edge of the gap, screaming in terror. Miller was there with his prize stallions. He tried to force the big horses into the mud to reach the children, but the heavy animals panicked. They sank deep into the soft, sucking earth and nearly drowned before they could be pulled back. The rancher's expensive wagons and ropes were useless against the power of the sludge. The horses were too heavy and too nervous for the unstable ground. Everyone watched in horror as the ledge holding the children began to crack. Then, the crowd parted. Elias walked forward with his 8 donkeys. They did not look like the useless bones the men had mocked weeks ago. They were thick with muscle and stood with their heads held high. The town went silent. Miller let out a desperate laugh and told Elias to get his trash out of the way before the donkeys were swept to their deaths. Elias did not answer. He didn't even look at the man. He gave a low whistle. The lead donkey stepped onto the edge of the mud. She did not panic. She tested the ground with one small, firm hoof. She moved with the steady rhythm Elias had taught her in the hidden valley. One by one, the other 7 followed. They were light enough to stay on top of the silt and strong enough to fight the pull of the current. The townspeople held their breath as the cowboy and his poker prizes vanished into the thick mist of the ravine, heading straight for the children that no one else could reach. The mud was like wet cement, pulling at everything that moved. But the 8 donkeys did not struggle. They moved with a calm, rhythmic pace that left the townspeople in total awe. Elias reached the crumbling ledge just as a large chunk of earth fell into the roaring water below. The children were crying, huddled together in fear. The teacher looked at Elias as if he were an angel appearing from the mist. Elias did not waste a second. He used the special harnesses he had built in the valley. He placed the children onto the backs of the donkeys, 2 at a time. The animals stood like rocks, refusing to flinch even when the ground beneath them shifted. The lead donkey, the one Elias had once carried on his shoulders, took the youngest child. She stood perfectly still, her long ears twitching as she waited for the signal. When everyone was loaded, Elias gave a sharp, short whistle. The team turned back toward the town. The journey across the ravine was even harder this time with the extra weight, but the donkeys did not falter. They found the solid spots in the mud that the heavy horses had missed. They leaned into the wind and pushed through the debris. When the first donkey stepped onto the solid grass of the town side, a roar of cheers went up that was louder than the storm. One by one, the children were lifted down into the arms of their parents. The townspeople who had once mocked Elias now stood in ashamed silence. Miller watched from the back of the crowd, his face red and his head hung low. He had lost his pride, but the town had gained something much better. Elias did not ask for a reward. He did not ask for an apology. He simply rubbed the ears of his lead donkey and began to walk back toward the mountains. The poor cowboy was still wearing his worn-out boots and his thin coat, but he walked with the posture of a king. From that day on, no one in the valley ever called a donkey worthless again. They knew that when the world falls apart, it isn't the fastest or the flashiest who save the day, it is the ones with the steady feet and the biggest hearts.